nature of blessing and the way that the characters seem to use and abuse the blessing God gives them as they pass it on. And what are we to make of all that?
There's like this blessing that is like the Eden blessing, or it's also the blessing of God going to reverse and confront evil, destroy evil through humanity to bring us back to Eden. And there's that blessing.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also just the blessing of like, hey, you're the patriarch and you get to hand down your inheritance to your firstborn child.
Yes. And all of those are offshoots of the core concept that I think really where this first unfolds in the 7-day creation narrative is humans as an image of the God who blesses and gives life.
Yeah.
So humans are enlisted as real partners with God in bringing his life and blessing and rule to the world. And that, that's a risky business to go into a partnership with somebody, especially if, they're going to make foolish decisions. So just in the same way that Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Abraham and all of them make good and bad decisions with the blessing that God gives them, I think part of that good and bad is expressed with how they pass it down to the different generations. So the question is, what makes the patriarchs have the ability to bless people? And so in one sense, they are the family that God chose to make the conduit of his Eden blessing.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, why did God choose that family? Here we're to the theme of the firstborn, like you're saying.
Now, one thing you did teach me about blessing that was really helpful was the first time it shows up is in Genesis 1.
Mm-hmm.
God creates the birds and the fish.
Yep.
And he blesses them.
You get the first blessing.
And that's the very first blessing in the Bible.
Yeah. Yep.
And it's a very specific blessing.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
It's multiply.
Be fruitful and multiply.
Be fruitful and multiply.
Yeah.
It's abundance. The blessing is
abundance.
Experience abundant life.
Mm-hmm.
Life that begets life because there's just enough.
Mm-hmm.
And so blessing is this idea of there's enough and life can multiply life.
Yep.
Because that word becomes very vague to me, like what is a blessing? And that's kind of the first question here is, what makes something a blessing?
Yeah.
And it's connecting to the source of all life. If you're telling someone and enacting that I want you to be connected to the source of all life to find abundance, then you're enacting a blessing.
That's right. Yeah. In other words, the words don't have some kind of magical power. It's the words that name a reality or wish a reality on someone. May the source of all life and abundance.
May his face shine upon you.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And then God invested that image-bearing power to bless to one particular family that both uses and abuses that responsibility. And these are the trials and errors of the family of Abraham in the story. So I think that's what's underneath the story of Isaac and Esau and Jacob, is that he is misusing the blessing authority that God's given him in that story because he's willing to trade it for his oldest son for a bowl of food. And that is not what God has planned.
But there does seem to be some inner narrative logic of like, oh, I already gave the blessing away. I can't give it away again.
Totally. Yeah, that's right. In terms of, because the narrative is all about God keeps selecting one through whom the promise of abundance and the promise of a future seed who will crush the snake.
I want to briefly explain my view of the nakash. Briefly stated, what I think happened in the garden was that a divine being, not a true member of the animal kingdom, that was associated with the divine council in some way, freely chose to oppose God's plan for humanity by prompting humanity to disobey God so that they would be either killed or removed from God's counsel and family. So, further, again, I don't believe, again, this was a normal member of the animal kingdom. I think it was a divine being, perhaps masquerading as an animal or taking some sort of serpentine form, who misleads humanity and causes their mortality, their loss of immortality in the garden. My major point, 2 points, are divine being, not a normal member of the animal kingdom. It's some sort of divine being. So, the word for that being, that figure in the garden, is nakash. What I think is going on here is a triple entendre. Nakash, as far as the root of the term, the 3 consonants, nun, chet, and shin in the Hebrew word, these 3 consonants are the root of a noun, a verb, and an adjective in Hebrew. If we take nakash as the noun, pointing to the noun, that would be the word for serpent. And of course, this is how all the translations go. It's perfectly understandable. There's nothing wrong with it. What my view says is what's wrong with it is assuming it's a member of the animal kingdom. So nakash could be serpent as a noun. Verbally, the verb means to deceive or practice divination, or deception through divination. So nakash here could speak of or describe or imply a deceiver, or again, some sort of being that had divine knowledge, and of course in the story uses that knowledge to manipulate humanity. Well, again, this certainly fits the story. Now, these 2 options, many commentators will notice, but somehow they still want to gravitate toward a member of the animal kingdom. I don't understand the thinking behind that, but at least they notice these 2 items. The third gets neglected. If you're thinking of how this root is used adjectively, or an alternative noun, it means bronzish or bronze, brazen, shining, okay, is the point. Brass shines. That's why it's attractive. So if you take nakash, and specifically the Hebrew text has hanakash here, it has the definite article, the term would mean the shining one. And I think that needs to be factored into the discussion of nakash in Genesis 3, because shining or luminosity is a quality that is frequently applied to divine beings in the Hebrew Bible and lots of other places in the ancient Near East. So this is why I say we have a triple entendre going on. We have some sort of being either manifesting as a serpent or a serpentine creature, but it's not a creature, it's not a member of the animal kingdom, it's a divine being who is luminous, shining, and has special divine knowledge and deceives humanity. Again, when I explain it that way, I think you're going to think, well, that sounds kind of normal. Well, and it is. I'm not saying anything that's just really odd or off the beaten path. What I'm trying to get, though, is I'm trying to factor in this luminosity idea, because that is intimately associated with a divine being and not a member of the animal kingdom. Moving on, we have the figure in question in Eden, obviously in Genesis 3. He wants to deceive Adam and Eve, and he tells them, look, when you eat of the tree, you're not going to die. You're going to become like one of the Elohim. And we know that it's plural because in verse 22 of Genesis 3, God says, hey, Adam and Eve have now become like one of us. Again, harkens back to the plural. They become like one of us, like Elohim in that verse. And so it's a very clear reference to the divine council setting that is Eden, okay, or that Eden is. Eden was the place of the council, and snakes, I'm sorry to say, were not members. Okay, animals were not members of the divine council, but divine beings were. And, as we just saw, sometimes those divine beings are described with serpentine imagery because they're throne guardians. Again, serpentine idea, seraphim. So you clearly have a figure who's lower level, who considers himself in charge, or ought to be in charge, and that's going to be his downfall. We don't necessarily know how that manifests in Ezekiel 28. In Genesis 3, it manifests by interfering with God's plan, God's will for humanity. Over in Isaiah 14, Helal ben Shakar, the Shining One, is described as wanting to set his throne on the mountain of God, the mountain of the divine assembly. He says, I will set my throne above the stars of El. And we know from passages like Job 38 that the sons of God are described as the stars of God. Again, it's clearly divine council imagery. It's clearly describing a being who wants to usurp authority that does not rightfully belong to him. Genesis 3 continuing, we get the curse, the outcome of the rebellion. The Lord God said unto the nakash, because you've done this, you're cursed more than all cattle and every created beast, so on and so forth. Upon your belly you shall go, you shall eat dust all the days of your life. Well, serpents don't actually eat dirt. There are critters that live below the ground that are below serpents, so if this is a literal member of the animal kingdom, we have problems there with the curse. Let the imagery guide the interpretation of the curse. I would say that the nakash is cast down to the ground. Keep that in mind, the ground, because in Ezekiel 28, just look over to your right, in Isaiah 14, we have the word eretz. Okay, ground. Eretz is also Sheol, the underworld. Okay, so I think what's going on in Genesis 3 is God says, look, you wanted to be above everything that is heavenly. I'm going to put you below everything that is heavenly. And in fact, I'm going to put you on the ground where beasts can tread on you. And even more than that, I'm going to put you under the ground in Sheol, okay, the cosmic underworld. You will be beneath every creature because now your domain is the domain of death. This is what Sheol was, the underworld, was the place of the dead. You are now Lord of the dead. You're not going to be head of the council. You're Lord of the dead. And again, this imagery gets played out in other passages later in the Old Testament. Ezekiel 28, again, the point is that this cherub figure is kicked out of the council paradise, the council headquarters, sent to Sheol, sent to Eretz. Again, the term can mean underworld and does in other passages, and you have some references there. Again, if you look at this and let the imagery drive the interpretation, which is its point, you come out with a very consistent picture of the rebellion of a divine being in all three passages, the result of which is being cast down to the realm of the dead, either the dirt in which people get buried, all right, and that animals walk over, Sheol, the grave, or the cosmic underworld realm of the dead. And this is where, again, the great cosmic enemy is depicted in both Old and New Testament and Second Temple literature. Why? Because God is a God of life and salvation. His opponent is death. And in Genesis 3, this is the result of the fall. Humanity loses immortality, driven out of the garden, away from the presence of God. You shall surely die means you have lost your immortality. You are now not going to be sustained in terms of this contingent immortality you have. You've lost your immortality. You're going to die.
There's this crazy story at the beginning of the Bible. We have Adam and Eve, and they're in the Garden of Eden.
And everything in this garden is great. It's exactly as it should be, except there's this one tree that they're told by God not to eat from because it's dangerous and it will kill them.
So that's it. Avoid this fruit tree and we're fine.
Right. It seems pretty simple. But in this garden, there's a snake. And it starts telling a different story. It says that if you eat of this tree, it's not going to kill you. In fact, it's going to make you become like God.
And Adam and Eve, they believe the snake and they eat the fruit.
And because of this, the goodness of the garden is tragically lost, and evil and death enters into God's good world.
Now, why is there a talking snake in the garden? I mean, this thing is a problem.
Yeah, it's very strange. And even more strange is the fact that the Bible doesn't say why or how this thing even got there. It just presents the snake as this creature who's in rebellion against God and that wants to get other people to doubt God's goodness and lead them on a path towards death. And so whatever this snake is, it's the source of evil that pervades our world and our lives, even still today.
But there is some hope, because right here in the story, God makes this really interesting promise to Adam and Eve.
That someone is going to come in the future, a son of Eve. And this guy's going to come and he's going to crush the serpent's head and destroy evil at its source. However, during this battle, the serpent is going to bite this guy's heel.
So it's like a mutual destruction.
Yeah, it's this very strange but beautiful promise. And it's just left hanging there until the next key moment in the story, when God singles out this guy named Abraham and says that through his family, goodness and blessing is going to be restored back to all of the nations of the world. And as we follow this family, we get to one of Abraham's great-grandsons, this guy named Judah. And he receives this promise that a king is going to come from his line and that the whole world's going to follow this king, and he's going to bring peace and harmony, and there'll be lots of food and wine and milk and vineyards, and it's going to be awesome.
The first king that we meet from the line of Judah is a guy named King David. And he's a hero. Maybe he is the snake crusher.
But it turns out that David is infected with the same evil as the rest of humanity. He never crushes the snake, just the opposite. However, God makes a promise to David that this king is going to eventually come from his line. But as you go on in the story, one by one, each generation of his sons, they're just total chumps. They give in to the snake, they choose evil, they go after money and sex and power and following other gods.
Things get so bad that they run the nation of Israel right into the ground, and the big bad empire of Babylon just takes them out.
And so now there are no more kings to even fulfill this promise.
So it seems like the whole plan is lost.
But during these dark days, there's this crazy group of guys called prophets, and they just kept talking about this coming king and reminding us of the promise that he'll come, he'll defeat evil, he'll restore the garden. Now, one specific prophet, Isaiah, he tells us more about why this king is bitten. Isaiah says that the promised king receives this wound because of humanity's evil, and then it kills him. But then all of a sudden he comes back, and Isaiah says it's because he suffered this wound that he can now become a source of healing to other people.
But the Old Testament ends, and the snake-crushing king that everyone's been talking about never shows up.
Whenever God engages a human as a partner after the Garden of Eden, the word and the formalized relationship of a covenant is always focused. It's first used in the story of Noah, where after the flood,
God makes a covenant.
God makes a covenant because of what Noah has done. He makes a covenant with Noah and his family and all creation to never send the flood again. Then there's the covenant with Abraham that gets deepened with and repeated with Isaac, Jacob, and then with the Israelites at Mount Sinai, and so on. So, but covenant is about formalizing, drawing up the terms of a relationship. And so the question is...
But wasn't there a formal term? Eat of all the trees and enjoy them, just not this one, which is taking good and bad in your own terms.
Yeah, the Eden relationship between God and humans has all of the elements of what will appear later in covenant relationships. It's just the word covenant is not used. And the question is it just taken for granted? Or is there a reason that it's not used? And this is a much longer conversation. I've, at least for a couple years now, have become persuaded that it's intentional.
Intentionally withheld.
No, intentionally withheld because I believe that the fact that the covenant is introduced after the flood is trying to communicate that a formalized relationship where you sign on the dotted line and agree to with benefits
Kind of
and
ancient
curses.
treaty kind of thing.
Yeah, that it's it's God's triage mechanism.
The first one was hang out with me in the garden.
Yeah.
And just listen to my words.
Trust my wisdom. Let's go for walks together. And we don't have to formalize this thing. And I think that is what Jeremiah is referring to when he talks about the new covenant. And you won't need anybody to teach you because God's instruction will be written on the heart.
Yeah.
So he uses the word covenant to describe that new setup. But then when he describes it, he describes about
something that's informal.
That's deeply intimate.
Yeah.
You don't need somebody to remind you of the covenant curses of the Torah to motivate you to do God's will, because you'll just want to do it. So I think it's intentional. And so the reason why that's relevant to the curse then is that blessing and curse is brought in for covenant language later. But the blessing is not contingent on human obedience.
The blessing, just shows up and humans get to enjoy it.
Yes, the blessing precedes human obedience. And so it's not about if you obey the divine word, then you get blessing. It's because of the divine blessing.
Here you are, enjoy the blessing.
Yes, and your continued enjoyment of it is in your hands. And so their blessing and curse take on more cosmic terms, where living by the divine will means that I continue to enjoy Eden blessing. And if I choose to forfeit it, then what I will bring upon myself is the opposite of blessing, which is curse. The man and the woman are not cursed. It's the snake and the ground that are cursed. It's only after the first murder of Adam and Eve's children, right? Cain is the first human that's cursed from the ground, and then he's exiled to the east. So there's something about blessing and curse that they get turned cosmic as images of life and death, blessing and curse, good and bad, which is what Moses makes all those connections at the end of Deuteronomy. So, but they're not covenantally contingent in the Eden narrative. You get the blessing and life and good because God loves to give good gifts. But you can forfeit it, in which case you will bring on yourself the opposite of all those things. And once that happens, then what God does is start arranging covenant relationships with all of that as conditional consequences, blessing or curse, which, is like a repair mechanism, but it's not the ideal.
Yeah, triage. I like that. Now, we kind of glossed over it. The humans aren't cursed after that. The land is cursed. The snake is cursed. But then you said that in the story of Cain,
he's cursed. Cursed,
and I don't remember that.
Cursed are you from the ground.
Oh, interesting. So why does it escalate like that? Why does it not start with a curse for humanity? It would make sense. I mean,
oh yeah,
they broke the Torah.
Totally. My hunch is that not my hunch. I think it's a sign of mercy.
Yeah.
Because if were he to curse Adam and Eve, then they would be bound. The whole project's over. But because Cain is cursed because he took a life, I think when him being cursed sets his lineage on a path towards death, which it will in the flood.
Yeah.
And the escalation of violence with Lamech and then the Nephilim, it all leads to the flood. Whereas Adam and Eve's line through Seth leads to the continued life of the snake crusher.
Okay.
Which God says, that's what actually he says about the man and the woman, is that you'll have seed that will give birth to the snake crusher. So I think it's a mercy.
Adam and Eve aren't cursed. Humanity would just be, it would be over, game over.
Correct.
But when we get to Cain and Abel, and then becomes Cain and Seth.
Yeah.
Cain chooses the cursed path, but there's still a line of humanity that doesn't.
Yeah, so Cain is cursed, not Adam and Eve. And then the ground is cursed, and not Adam and Eve. But remember, there's a close relationship, because the ground is Adamah in Hebrew, and human is Adam, and the Adam comes from the Adamah. So
it depends on the Adamah for life.
Yeah, correct.
I hope you guys are enjoying the channel. I want to take a moment and ask for you to subscribe. We're growing rapidly, and I am so grateful for the reach that God's given this channel, but I want it to continue to grow so we can help get this message out about the good news about what God's done for this world and the hope that we have in Jesus. So if you could take just a quick minute, it's only a second to you, but to me it means a lot. Just press the subscribe button for us. Click on that and follow us. We're going to have a lot of great content coming out in the future and a lot of great content to check out in the past. So just wanted to pause and say thank you guys for all that you're doing for this channel, and please subscribe.
Chapter 4 is tracing Cain's genealogy.
Yeah.
That like culminates in this.
Yeah. It's the genealogy of the disgruntled, envious, murderous firstborn. And that leads to Lamech.
The king who's now just like a murderous, polygamous.
City of blood,
Just-
murderous, a distorted image of God's generosity. Chapter 5 comes back and it reboots and it reminds us that Adam and Eve were made in the image of God. And then the lineage starts going through Seth, and it's fascinating, it goes through 10 generations.
Seth, who's the third born.
Seth, who's now the third born, and that's the family that God is going to provide the seed of the woman through, which we haven't. The seed of the woman who's going to crush the snake.
I guess it's important because it's like, why we're going to start talking about God choosing over and over who to give the blessing to.
Yeah, that's right.
And so like there is a logic there
that's
of why God's choosing a family to carry a blessing.
That's right. The logic is he's going to raise up from among the humans, this is when Adam and Eve are exiled, a future descendant from the woman who will strike the snake while also being struck by it. And you're also told that the snake is going to have offspring along with the woman. And you're like, well, how is that going to happen? How is this?
Yeah, why do I care about baby snakes?
Yeah, baby snakes.
Genesis 6 describes the second supernatural rebellion. Some of the sons of God, members of the heavenly council, transgressed the boundary between heaven and earth.
The sons of God saw the daughters of humankind, that they were beautiful. The Nephilim were upon the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humankind, and they bore children to them.
The answer lies in the offspring produced by the forbidden union between the sons of God and the women in Genesis 6. Those offspring were known as the Nephilim. They were giants. Their descendants became the giant clans Moses and Joshua battled.
The Nephilim were upon the earth in those days, and also afterward.
Extra-biblical Jewish writers believe that demons, like those described in the Gospels, were disembodied spirits of the giants. They base this on the Bible's mention of dead Rephaim in the underworld. Jewish books like 1st Enoch and the Book of the Giants from the Dead Sea Scrolls make that point explicitly.
And then Genesis 5 kicks us back and restarts, literally goes back to the first words of Genesis 1 and 2 about God making male and female in his image. And then it gives a birth line from Adam as if Cain doesn't exist. We've written him off. And wherever that future seed, snake crushing seed of the woman is going to come from, it's going to come from now the third born, the real latecomer. And that's what Genesis 5 is about. It's a genealogy. And it takes 10 generations leading all the way up to the 10th son, Noah, and Noah also has 3 sons. And so you get these parallel genealogies of through Cain, you get 7 generations that lead to Lamech and his 3 sons. That's a city of blood. And then you get the line of Seth, which is 10 generations, and the 10th son, Noah, has 3 sons.
Yeah. And what's confusing is there's some similar names in both genealogies, right?
Yes. Like some are identical, and others...
Like Enoch, Cain's
exactly.
firstborn, is like the 7th born. Oh, there you have it.
Yep.
Who's the famous Enoch, who goes to like just gets beamed up to God.
Yeah, totally. Through Cain, you get Adam to Cain, to Enoch, to Irad, to Mehujael, to the Methushael, to Lamech and his 3 sons. Next chapter, you go from Adam to Seth to Enosh, which is another Hebrew word for human. Then you get Canaan, which is spelled with the same letters as Cain's name. Then you get Mahalalel, which is, he's the 5th generation from
And that
Adam.
sounds so much like
It sounds Mehujael, which is the 5th generation from Adam through Cain.
Yeah.
Then you get Yered, who's spelled almost identically to the 4th generation of Cain, Irad. Then you get Enoch, the famous Enoch, who gets taken, and he was not, for God took him. And that's the same name as Cain's firstborn son,
Yeah.
Enoch. Then you get Methuselah, the oldest human in the biblical story, and the letters of his names are just swapped around with Methushael, the 6th generation from Cain. And then you get 2 Lamechs.
You get another Lamech.
Another Lamech, and then you get Noah. So what's interesting is some people have thought, oh, actually, there maybe were just 2 oral traditions of the same genealogy
Right.
that are being preserved here.
Okay.
And that may or may not be true. But narratively, the narrative is going to great pains to separate these 2 lineages. And I think the rhyming of all the names is painting them as these inverted mirrors of them. In other words, it's hard to tell the lineage of the snake and the lineage of the woman apart.
Oh, interesting.
They're going on parallel tracks. And
That's how it feels when you read it. It's so hard to keep track.
Yeah, the name similarities are a literary strategy to show that the seed of the snake and the seed of the woman are hard to tell apart. And even though you think in the narrative it's clear separation of lines, the rest of Genesis is going to go on to show that anybody can become a snake.
Well, that's interesting.
And you can unbecome a snake and become a human image. That's what the story of Jacob is all about. He's born a snake, but God tries to turn him into a
Whoa.
into
Throwing
a
all these
human.
little nuggets in here.
Anyway, so what's interesting is that what's implied is, what's up with all these generations in the story of the firstborn? We don't really know. But what is interesting is God is choosing the thirdborn, Seth, from Adam and Eve, and making that the future line of the seed of the woman, because that's the main genealogy that's going to get traced throughout the rest of Genesis.
So it seems like the whole plan is lost.
But during these dark days, there's this crazy group of guys called prophets, and they just kept talking about this coming king and reminding us of the promise that he'll come, he'll defeat evil, he'll restore the garden. Now, one specific prophet, Isaiah, he tells us more about why this king is bitten. Isaiah says that the promised king receives this wound because of humanity's evil, and then it kills him. But then all of a sudden he comes back, and Isaiah says it's because he suffered this wound that he can now become a source of healing to other people.
But the Old Testament ends, and the snake-crushing king that everyone's been talking about never shows up.
And this is why, when the New Testament begins, it introduces us to Jesus of Nazareth, not as some random guy, but as someone who comes to fulfill these specific ancient promises.
Yeah, we learn that he's from the line of David, Judah, and Abraham.
And he goes around Israel announcing that the goodness of God's kingdom is here, now. And he begins confronting the effects of evil on people by healing them, by forgiving them of their sins and evil.
Many people are now believing that this is, in fact, the promised king.
But Jesus began telling his closest followers that he was going to become king and bring peace by taking the full effect of humanity's evil into himself.
The fatal snakebite wound.
Exactly. And so it seems like the serpent wins. And this story actually would be a tragedy except for what happens next. Jesus rises from the dead.
And now Jesus has the power over evil and death for himself.
And so the rest of the New Testament is then making this claim that Jesus' power over evil and death has now become available to us to begin confronting the effects of evil in our lives.
But even still, death and evil are a real problem in our world all around us.
And so the story of the Bible ends by describing this future day when Jesus comes back and he finishes the job. He destroys the snake once and for all, and he restores the goodness of the garden here on earth. Story is giving us a really robust depiction of spiritual evil and how it's fully intertwined with human rebellion and evil. it's easy to reject a lot of this for modern readers because they associate it with, Satanism or witchcraft or something with a pentagram on it. And that's not what the biblical authors are trying to say. The twin spiritual human rebellion of Babylon is a political economic system. It's a cultural system. In the book of Revelation, Babylon is talked about as being the merchant of the whole world, the economic engine of the whole world, including slavery. And that's what gets brought down, when Babylon falls. And so the biblical authors want us to imagine that we're all inhabiting cultural systems that are participating in a human spiritual rebellion, but also on a personal level. When I entertain, when I dehumanize someone else as my tribe superior to you, you're less human, you probably don't deserve to be here. The biblical authors would say we are participating in dragging the world back into death and chaos.
The amount of death I will allow in the world around me and in others so that I can enjoy something.
Correct. Yeah.
When I stop and really appraise that,
Yep.
it's pretty startling.
It is startling.
And we all
disturbing.
We all do that.
That's right. So, and this is, when you read the Gospels, this is what Jesus was constantly talking about.
Yeah.
This is why he didn't start a revolutionary war against Rome.
Because Rome was captive to something greater.
Yeah, he went out to the desert for 40 days to conquer the real enemy that was tempting him to take the kingdom of God over the world, but through violent force.
Yeah.
And he resisted that, and he went about confronting a spiritual enemy that had captured a lot of people's bodies and minds and hearts. When he was in the Garden of Gethsemane in the Gospel of Luke, and he's getting arrested, he calls it, "This is the time for the power of the dark." That's what he says. And he allows the power of the darkness to overcome him.
I hope you guys are enjoying the channel. I want to take a moment and ask for you to subscribe. We're growing rapidly, and I am so grateful for the reach that God's given this channel, but I want it to continue to grow so we can help get this message out about the good news about what God's done for this world and the hope that we have in Jesus. So if you could take just a quick minute, it's only a second to you, but to me it means a lot. Just press the subscribe button for us. Click on that and follow us. We're going to have a lot of great content coming out in the future and a lot of great content to check out in the past. So just wanted to pause and say thank you guys for all that you're doing for this channel, and please subscribe.